Hello, my name is Tyler Curtis, and this is my presentation on my essay, False Identity and the American Dream in the Great Gatsby, which I wrote for the course Finding Home, Space, Place, and Identity with Dr. Justine Paas. I'd like to thank her for nominating me for this student research conference. I never thought I'd get to present my research in this kind of way, and it makes it really special to feel like there's actually value in something I wrote. So I guess I'll just hop right into it. So I started out, I really needed to decide a path, and we had, I think, 3 or 4 novels that we could choose from to write this essay about, and The Great Gatsby immediately stood out to me because everybody had to read it in high school, apparently, except for me. I'd never read The Great Gatsby, and everybody always talks about it. I know it's, a very prominent book in the world of literature, and people always talk about these theories around it, and I knew that since it was so prominent, it would give me a huge resource of just information and different essays, research that had already been done on it to kind of pull from to make my own conclusions. Pretty much every single essay I write comes from my background working with Lacanian theory and psychoanalytic criticism, which I learned originally about in Methods of Literary Study with Dr. Schnellman. So big shout out to her for that class. It's changed immensely how I approach literature and how I approach literary analysis. And that is actually what led me to look at how Fitzgerald's personality influenced the themes of this book. So his politics, his personal beliefs, his personal history, all of those things I will kind of paint to show that, Fitzgerald, I mean, he's the one that wrote the book, but it was a little more autobiographical than I think he intended it to be. But big shout out to everyone in the Lindenwood School of Humanities. All of my professors have been amazing, and they've all been a huge help on all of my assignments. So a little background on F. Scott Fitzgerald. Full name Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald, born 1896, and he was definitely part of the aristocracy, which led to the beliefs that swayed his view of the Great Gatsby. Like I was kind of already mentioning, his politics, his views on immigration, his views on sexuality. Those things are heavily swayed by who he is as a person. The main character of the story, Jay Gatsby, he's a direct representation of Fitzgerald. I think that is somewhat unintentionally, but he is intentionally a representation of the nation and of the American dream. And my whole claim with this is that he is a false representation of that, which I will get into later. There's also a character who is the narrator of the story, Nick Carraway, and he is, in the way he works in this research, he is essentially the unconscious of Fitzgerald, and he's Fitzgerald reacting to the depiction of Jay Gatsby. And I'll kind of go into that a little more too. So I broke this out into sections to make it a little easier to talk about, the first section being the American dream. I started out with pointing out in where Lionel Trilling is quoted in Barbara Wills' The Great Gatsby and the Obscene Word, saying that Gatsby comes inevitably to stand for America itself. That's just kind of saying that yes, Gatsby is accepted as a representation of America. I also say for Gatsby to be a representation of the American dream, he must show that it is possible to rise from a birth in poverty to a life in wealth. He has to show that the American dream is acting how it's supposed to. Gatsby is an immigrant, and he has made a life for himself, but he has to do that through the system that's already in place. I quote Vanneman and Cannon here in The American Perception of Class. Discontent with one's position would inspire workers to change their positions within the system rather than trying to change the system itself. I go on to say after that, the American dream cannot be real if the only way to achieve it is through corruption, murder, and crime. Breaking the rules of the system is inherently trying to change the system. So because he's breaking the rules of the system and trying to change the system itself, he is showing that the American dream is false, at least in this context, in the story, in the way that he represents it. He is corrupt and won his wealth through gambling rackets and essentially smuggling and some other shady dealings that are alluded to but never really directly put on the table. Because of the way he won his wealth he is not a representation of the American dream. That's not to say the American dream doesn't exist, but in this context, it is a false basis of the story. I go on to the next section to talk about Lacanian theory, and this is kind of the crux of the whole story here. I talk about in this section, which is pretty short because theory stuff can get really hairy really quick if you're not careful, and I didn't want to spend too much time trying to break everything down. I just kind of wanted to point and say, hey, this is where I got this idea from, and this is how we can apply it here. In Matthew Berry's The Beginning Theory, which is where I pulled most of my research from for this essay, we talk about the signifier versus the signified. So the signifier is Jay Gatsby. The signified, as far as F. Scott Fitzgerald is concerned, is the American dream. Now, do we see it that way? I guess that's, to interpret personally, but the way I see it and the way I portrayed in my essay, no, we don't see Gatsby as a representation of the American dream because of everything I just laid out. This whole idea of the signifier being separate from the signified can be really easily explained in this example I heard from Dr. Schnoman in her class. Think of a dog. You might think of a different dog than I do. You probably do because I think of my dog Charlie. He's a very, very beautiful golden retriever. And the fact that I think of a different dog than you shows that breakdown of the signifier, which is just the word dog, and the signified, which is whatever image pops into your brain. That is that breakdown working. And that's how we're able to see this jump from what Fitzgerald was trying to show to what we end up reading about, which is a corrupt, false version of the American dream. Matthew Berry also goes on to talk about the unconscious being structured as a language. This is kind of a breakdown of Lacanian theory. And Dr. Poss also quotes Gramsci in her dissertation, Finding Home in Babel, that says something very similar about how the unconscious works. And this is basically pointing to what I've already said, which is because of Fitzgerald's beliefs, his political standings, and who he is, how he was brought up, that changes how he writes. And like I already said, because he did not go through the American dream, he was not born poor and did not create a life for himself. He was born into an aristocratic family. He's never really dealt with the American dream, and that's why I think his story fails. The third section is Gatsby's false identity. So this gets kind of hairy too, not as hairy as theory stuff, but I have a very long quote here that I'm just going to read because I spent a lot of time on it in the essay, and I think it's the best way to kind of break it down. His feelings led to beliefs in immigration restriction, and will even go so far to say that Fitzgerald was suspicious of those who threatened the group to which he felt he belonged, the old American aristocracy. Excuse me. This old aristocracy, the group that Tom belongs to, aligns itself against Gatsby in such a way that there is no choice but for him to be destroyed. Gatsby himself is the immigrant, the outsider, the one who is threatening this aristocracy, and therefore Fitzgerald's only choice in his subconscious is to destroy him. Nick Carraway, the voice of Fitzgerald, as we can plainly now see, which I will address next, says as much himself throughout the novel in the statement about unaffected scorn and saying that Gatsby turned out all right, implying he got what he deserved. In Fitzgerald's mind, Gatsby got what he deserved because of his history and his distance from the true aristocracy as Fitzgerald sees it. So this belief of Fitzgerald's about immigration, that is essentially the downfall of Gatsby. His relationship with Nick and his relationship with Tom are also because of Fitzgerald's beliefs, like I just pointed out. There's also, I don't mean to keep bumping my desk, I'm sorry. There's also a breakdown of his relationship with Nick, basically saying that because of Fitzgerald's certain history, which I will actually go into on the next slide, I believe, his relationship it portrays Fitzgerald's view on sexuality, and it is, obviously, I haven't painted Fitzgerald very lightly, but his racism and his sexism and his views on sexuality they show very heavily in this book and paint it in a very dark light. But we go on to, in section 4, talk about Gatsby as a fake aristocrat, which I already kind of mentioned. These do blur together quite a bit because of the way that the theory works, and then talk about Nick Carraway and ultimately the politics of Fitzgerald. I broke it down a little further in the essay into talking about how it's shown in the book versus how it's shown in how I interpret it in my essay and then what it means. But for the purposes of this presentation, it all kind of blends together. So the reflection on Fitzgerald, there are two possibilities. Either he intentionally showed these things about Jay Gatsby being false, or it was unintentional. I think it was unintentional. I don't think that Fitzgerald was intentionally openly sexist, racist, and had those terrible views on sexuality, but that doesn't matter. He ultimately did it to himself. This potent concoction of Fitzgerald's own beliefs creates the image of Gatsby, which I have a quote here. This character that he has created in Gatsby, a simultaneous concoction of love for the nation, portrayal of corruption, mirror of shame, and vessel of corruption, is indeed a reflection of his own feelings about the nation and even about himself. So this image that he's created exposes him. This is the quote I was talking about, the depiction of Nick and Gatsby's relationships. This is from Frolic. It reveals the author's unease about his relationship with a Catholic priest and teacher, Sigourney Fay, and provides insight into the author's well-known lifelong anxiety about his gender and sexuality. This unease about gender and sexuality may very well transfer into his projecting stereotypes and misconceptions onto Gatsby, essentially using him as a catch-all scapegoat for his own guilt. So that's kind of what I've been saying. This also goes on to the same thing I mentioned before. It is Gatsby's history that makes him unworthy in the eyes of Tom. This is about immigration. And incidentally, in the eyes of Fitzgerald, showing further Fitzgerald's distrust of anything not part of the old white aristocracy he so firmly believed in. So, like I said before, this background of Fitzgerald, it really shows through Gatsby. These are things that are very clear in the story. And once you start to realize that these themes also show up in Fitzgerald's life, you start to see that reflection and see that this story is more of a falsity. The identity of Gatsby isn't true. It's really Fitzgerald's own identity that he's portraying onto a character and kind of hiding from himself in. So I kind of go on to break it down a little more in an internal versus external conflict. So the internal is Jay Gatsby versus James Gatz. James Gatz being the true name of Jay Gatsby and Jay Gatsby being the alter ego. So James Gatz can never have success, at least in the eyes of Fitzgerald and the way he wrote this book, because he is an immigrant and because he is alluded to being Jewish. Jay Gatsby is created as this white, successful aristocrat who can be successful, but ultimately he's depicted as, being corrupt, so he's not truly successful in the eyes of the American dream. Ultimately, both identities can't coexist, but Jay Gatsby doesn't exist in the first place, so it kind of leads to this old identity versus new identity, where at the end of the book you start to see Jay Gatsby realize that he can't be Jay Gatsby, he is James Gatz, and that leads to this eventual implosion. Externally is kind of the nation. Gatsby is a representative of America and the American dream, and Gatsby is depicted as corrupt and deceptive. So it's depiction versus what we know is the intention. America is said to be a place of opportunity and success, but if Gatsby is corrupt and deceptive, then it's not a place of opportunity and success, because the success was achieved through sleazy, illegal things. And this shows that depiction of nation versus reality, or ideal depiction that Fitzgerald was going for versus the reality of what he painted, which, again, a result of who he is. The conclusion is Jay Gatsby cannot exist as a depiction of the nation and a contradiction to what the nation stands for. He is a paradox and must implode because his existence is impossible, which is why we see him end up dying in the end. Conclusion of the essay, I'll just read it straightforward for you. I think it, like I read before, I painted it really well in the essay, and I think trying to summarize it wouldn't really make any sense. The image of the American dream that Fitzgerald thus paints for the reader is one that the reader may ultimately reject. Readers are left with pity for Gatsby, not hope or reverence. The two observations outlined above, that of Gatsby's role as a source of conflict, again intentional or otherwise, and Fitzgerald's impact on Gatsby's actions, both inhibit the reader from finding Gatsby to be the dream that Fitzgerald was intending him as. The dream to Gatsby means wealth and a place in the aristocracy, but he found wealth through corruption and was rejected by the aristocracy. He became the very thing he was trying to escape. He became an outsider living the life that he envisioned, but as far from his goals as ever.